How's everyone doing tonight? First, I would like to thank you all for coming out tonight. I would also like to thank 1199C for providing this space for us. It was several weeks ago when Dr. Montero and I met with Henry Nicholas and we told him about the event. And without hesitation, he allowed us to use this space. So just on behalf of the Saturday Free School, we want to express our gratitude to 1199C. This evening, the Saturday Free School welcomes Dr. Norman Finkelstein to the city of Philadelphia. Dr. Finkelstein will be giving a historical context of the Palestine-Israel conflict and presenting the information in his book, Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom. Following his lecture, we will be conducting a roundtable discussion with Dr. Finkelstein and Dr. Anthony Montero, along with an open dialogue which the audience is invited to participate in. With the information provided by Dr. Finkelstein, we will discuss a way forward in achieving a solution for the Palestine-Israel conflict and its role in a movement for world peace. The Saturday Free School believes that we must correctly identify the place of the Palestine-Israel conflict in the struggle to bring justice to the masses of suffering people across the world in order to ultimately help the Palestinian cause. We recognize the Palestine Solidarity Movement's failure in educating the broad public on the conflict and its defection from the international community, which hindered opportunities for forward progress to end Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. We do not see this conflict as an issue unto itself, but as part and parcel with the global struggle to free humanity as a whole. As we celebrate the year of W.E.G. Du Bois's 150th birthday, we also approach the 90th birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. on January 15th. Their life work of constant struggle for peace and justice propels us to uncompromisingly work toward a new future as we confront the challenges we are faced with. The moral bankruptcy of this decadent Western civilization has poisoned the minds of our youth. Conditioned by a culture of individualism and celebrity worship, our generation has become blind to our capacity to free ourselves from the ideological chains of white supremacy. Universities, which serve as think tanks for the ruling elite, ingrains in youth the values of pessimism and cowardice, teaching a worldview that holds the common man and woman in contempt. In American academia, knowledge is produced in service of exploiters and warmongers rather than for the freedom of humanity. Martin Luther King Jr. in his speech, 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life, asserted, an individual hasn't begun to live until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Following King's brave example, we must take a position against the purveyors of war, racism, and poverty within our own government that are inflicting suffering on the world's majority, which are all tied in what King called a single garment of destiny. We must teach not for career gains, but to use truth as an instrument for the liberation of the oppressed. By knowing who the enemies of humanity are and how they operate, we will break social barriers meant to divide us and see each other for what we really are, brothers and sisters in the same struggle. As we celebrate the 90th birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. and the 150th anniversary of the birth of W.E.B. Du Bois, we honor them by calling upon all self-proclaimed fighters for peace and justice to anchor themselves in the same moral courage and commitment. By sacrificing one's own interests for the interests of humanity, and by taking a position on what is neither safe nor popular, but what is right. That's right. It is in this spirit that we welcome everyone to Palestine and Israel within the struggle for world peace and justice. I would like to introduce a member of the Saturday Free School, Serafina Harris. She will be reading Du Bois's Credo.
Right on.
I believe in God, who made of one blood all nations that on earth do dwell. I believe that all men, black and brown and white, are brothers, varying through time and opportunity, in form and gift and feature, but differing in no essential particular, and alike in soul and the possibility of infinite development. Especially do I believe in the Negro race, in the beauty of its genius, the sweetness of its soul, and its strength, that meekness which shall yet inherit this turbulent earth. I believe in pride of race and lineage and self, in pride of self so deep as to scorn injustice to other selves, in pride of lineage so great as to despise no man's father, in pride of race so chivalrous as neither to offer bastardy to the weak, nor beg wedlock of the strong, knowing that men may be brothers in Christ, even though they be not brothers in law. I believe in service, humble, reverent service, from the blackening of boots to the whitening of souls. For work is heaven, idle is hell, and wage is the well done of the Master, who summoned all them that labor and are heavy laden, making no distinction between the black, sweating cotton hands of Georgia and the families and the first families of Virginia, since all distinction, not based on deed, is devilish and not divine. I believe in the devil and his angels, who wantonly work to narrow the opportunity of struggling human beings, especially if they be black, who spit in the faces of the fallen, strike them that cannot strike again, believe the worst, and work to prove it, hating the image which their maker stamped on a brother's soul. I believe in the Prince of Peace. I believe that war is murder. I believe that armies and navies are at bottom the tinsel and braggadocio of oppression and wrong. And I believe that the wicked conquest of weaker and darker nations by nations whiter and stronger but foreshadows the death of that strength. I believe in liberty for all men, the space to stretch their arms and their souls, the right to breathe and the right to vote, the freedom to choose their friends, enjoy the sunshine, and ride on the railroads, uncursed by color, thinking, dreaming, working as they will in a kingdom of beauty and love. I believe in the training of children, black even as white, the leading out of little souls into green pastures beside the still waters, not for pelf or peace, but for life lit by some larger vision of beauty and goodness and strength, lest we forget, and the sons of the fathers, like a sow, for mere meat barter their birthright in a mighty nation. Finally, I believe in patience. Patience with the weakness of the weak and the strength of the strong, the prejudice of the ignorant and the ignorance of the blind. Patience with the tardy triumph of joy and the mad chastening of sorrow. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm going to introduce Norman Finkelstein, but before I do, I'd like to read the statement of Angela Davis to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. As you all are probably aware, she was invited to receive a high honor, the Fred Shuttlesworth Award from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And for reasons now that we are very cognizant of, she was, the whole thing was called off. And it was because of her stance in solidarity with the Palestinian people. So she writes, and this is on January 7th, 2019, and let me just remind you that Angela Davis was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. She was friend to the 4 little girls that were killed in the bombing of the church in 1963.
That's right.
And she was a friend to the daughter, and is a friend to the daughter of Fred Shuttlesworth, in whose name the award that she was to receive is given. Now, let me just say, there's anybody that knows Fred Shuttlesworth, a man of infinite courage, fearless man, he himself would have embraced Angela Davis having received the award in his name. But let me read Angela's statement. On Saturday, January 5th, I was stunned to learn that the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute Board of Directors had reversed their previous decision to award me the Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award. Although the BCRI refused my request to reveal the substantive reasons for this action, I later learned that my long-term support of justice for the Palestine people was at issue. This seemed particularly unfortunate, given that my own freedom was secured and indeed my life was saved by a vast international movement, and I have devoted much of my own activism to international solidarity and specifically to linking struggles in other parts of the world to U.S. grassroots campaigns against police violence, the prison industrial complex, and racism more broadly. The rescinding of this invitation and the cancellation of the event where I was scheduled to speak was thus not primarily an attack against me, but rather against the very spirit of the indivisibility of justice. I support Palestinian political prisoners, just as I support current political prisoners in the Bois County in Catalonia, in India, and in other parts of the world. I have indeed expressed opposition to policies and practices of the State of Israel, as I expressed similar opposition to U.S. support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine and to other discriminatory U.S. policies. Through my experiences at Elizabeth Irwin High School in New York City and at Brandeis University in the late 50s and early 60s, and my subsequent time in graduate school in Frankfurt, Germany, I have learned to be as passionate about opposition to anti-Semitism as to racism. It was during this period that I was also introduced to the Palestinian cause. I am proud to have worked closely with Jewish organizations and individuals on issues of concern to all of our communities throughout my life. In many ways, this work has been integral to my growing consciousness regarding the importance of protesting the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The trip to Birmingham, where I was born and raised, to receive the Fred Shuttlesworth Award was certain to be the highlight of my year, especially since I knew Reverend Shuttlesworth personally and attended school with his daughter Patricia, and because of my mother Sally B. Davis, worked tirelessly for the BCRI during its early years. Moreover, my most inspirational Sunday school teacher, Odessa Woolfolk, was the driving force for the Institute's creation. Despite the BCRI's regrettable decision, I look forward to being in Birmingham in February for an alternative event organized by those who believe that the movement for civil rights in this moment must include a robust discussion of all of the injustices that surround us. Angela Y. Davis. Great civil rights fighter for justice and against imperialism. I I have the honor of introducing Norman Finkelstein, the eminent scholar of the Middle East conflict, the Palestinian struggle, and the role of Israel in the Middle East. I don't have a lot to say, just I first encountered the name Norman Finkelstein in the mid-1990s when I happened upon a copy of his book, The Holocaust Industry. And if you haven't read it, it's worth getting. He is the son of two Holocaust survivors. I then encountered him a second time on Democracy Now! In a debate with Alan Dershowitz. A famous debate, which it's hard sometimes to find on YouTube. It goes on and off. And I was impressed with several things, including the fact that it seems that he has a photographic memory, because he knew Dershowitz's book better than Dershowitz knew his own book. And on one occasion, there's one phrase that sticks with me when he said to Alan Dershowitz, he says, "Alan Dershowitz, I've read your book twice." And then he hesitated and said, "No, I've read your book 3 times, because I read the book that you plagiarized from." Do you remember that? He completely destroyed Alan Dershowitz, who parades sometimes as a liberal, but is in fact a right-winger. Then I probed a little bit into his life. I was very interested in the fact that Norman always made it clear that his parents were Holocaust survivors. And I found out that which I think would be a good book to write, Norman, your parents' biography. But he said that his parents would never allow in their household the criticism of Stalin. And I found that quite interesting. And then I learned that he said that growing up, the hero of his life was Paul Robeson. So when I put all of this together, I said, well, this guy was raised the right way. He had good parents. And he doesn't always show it, of course. Then I read an article where he talked about his early ultra-leftist days and so on. But the thing that has impressed me most is his scholarship. I've just completed, or am completing, I should say, his current book entitled Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, published by the University of California Press. It is devastating for those who would defend the Israeli massacre in the Gaza Strip. So without further ado, it gives me pleasure and honor, and this is only the second time I've been in his presence, by the way, to introduce and bring to you Professor Norman Finkelstein.
Well, when you get to be my age, virtually every statement made by somebody prompts a memory or prompts a thought. And if I were to go through all the promptings I had this evening, it would consume the whole night and probably then some. So just to be brief, I don't come often to Philadelphia. I would have many memories. I do recall I was here in July 4th, 1976. There was a big demonstration, counter-demonstration for the bicentennial. And there were 2 demonstrations, one by the true radicals And then there was another one led by Jane Fonda, who insisted on raising the American flag. And it was something that rubbed me the wrong way back then. And even though she probably had a point in retrospect, the intuitions that she was a sort of a fake first surfaced back then for myself. The second memory I have of Philadelphia is when Mayor Wilson Goode carried out the first domestic bombing in American history. Second?
Yeah.
What was the first?
Tulsa, Oklahoma.
1921.
Tulsa was it? No.
Greenwood race riot.
Wilson Goode was well before Tulsa, wasn't it?
Afterwards.
1921.
It was a bombing?
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay, well,
Black community in Tulsa wiped out.
Black Wall Street was destroyed, and many people saw the destruction as similar to a bombing.
oh, similar to a bombing, but
In terms of the level of destruction.
right, but this was the first domestic actual aerial bombing by a progressive mayor. And so, then I have a childhood friend who, so to speak, ended up building Philadelphia. How many people here know the name Alan Greenberger? You know, I went to high school with him, and he made quite a name for himself here. I understand he designed many of the landmark buildings in Philadelphia. I haven't seen him in 50 years, so here's a shout out to Alan Greenberger. One which I think, coming from me, he would prefer not to hear. Then we moved on to W.E.B. Du Bois, and as it happened just a couple of weeks ago, I was rereading Du Bois's biography of John Brown. And it was interesting for me. I was teaching a class on Great American Speeches, and I was going to do Frederick Douglass's speech on John Brown, which is a genuine tour de force. So I figured in order to prepare for that, I would read Du Bois's biography alongside several others of John Brown. And he posed a question which has always been an enigma to me. John Brown, the great white abolitionist, he saw himself as an instrument of God. He was doing God's work, and he was, by any reckoning, it would be fair to characterize him as he, I suspect, would characterize himself. He was a fanatic in the service of justice. And then the question arises, how do you know at the time that the fanaticism you have invested in your cause, whether that cause is right or not? Because one can make the argument, and I think it is a legitimate argument. John Brown thought that slavery was a crime, the crime of all crimes. It had to be abolished, and that the use of violent force to abolish it was completely legitimate. Okay, history vindicated him. Actually, a song was composed in his name. John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. But then along comes somebody who opposes abortion, and he is equally committed, or it's usually a he, he's equally committed to the proposition that he's carrying out God's will. And there's an element of fanaticism. And just as John Brown thought it was legitimate to kill slaveholders, to abolish slavery, an anti-abortion activist thinks it's legitimate to kill doctors who perform abortion. And he is as committed, convinced of, persuaded of his belief as was John Brown. And then, how do you know he's wrong? How do you know what will history's verdict be? At the time John Brown carried out his act, or acts, there were many, Slavery was a live issue. It was still being debated. It wasn't, so to speak, intellectually resolved. They had roughly the same status in public life as abortion does now, namely a 50-50 split in American society. And I was curious, one of the reasons I picked up Du Bois's book was I was wondering how he would resolve that question. And basically he came to the conclusion which I myself and my own intuitions came to, which he says, you don't know. You don't know what history will decide. It's impossible to tell at the moment which way history's verdict is going to go. So it's, I think it's an interesting political dilemma. It's a moral dilemma, and it's also an interesting political dilemma. Frederick Douglass also confronts that question in his great speech on John Brown, which is definitely worth reading. There was something about Douglass's oratory that even on the page, you can feel the pages trembling with his language. It's just, there's nothing quite like it, probably because he was so steeped in the Bible and he was able to capture that biblical language. It's a real impressive display of language and oratory. And the last thing is, yes, I did grow up in a, I'm not sure if you would say my parents were inspirational, but there was one part of that which I would like to mention. My parents were faithful to their causes, and it couldn't be bought. And that was actually a lesson for me. You can agree or you can disagree, but it was my parents' opinion, which I think history bears out, that it was the Soviet Union that defeated fascism, there was the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis, the Americans played next to no role, the British played a relatively minor role. I remember when I was in 7th grade and we happened to open up the history textbooks, and there was a bar graph showing the numbers of people who were killed during World War II. So there were the Americans, 200,000, and then the British, 400,000, and then you come to Russia, 30 million. And suddenly, the war looked very different in the way it was depicted in American television, where you would think that the US won World War II. Well, my parents, I don't like the term Holocaust survivor because it's been so cheapened and falsified. My parents were survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, death camps, and then the slave labor camps. My mother was, both of them were in the Warsaw Ghetto until April 1943, when the ghetto uprising was defeated. The survivors, who numbered about 20 or 30,000, were then deported to Majdanek concentration camp. Both of my parents were in Majdanek. My father was then deported to Auschwitz concentration camp. He was on the Auschwitz death march. My mother was deported to 2 slave labor camps. She was liberated by the Russians. My father was liberated by the Americans. And so they felt a huge debt to Stalin. And they create all sorts of illusions for themselves for complex, I think, psychological reasons. And they wouldn't brook any criticism of Stalin. If you criticized him, in their minds, you were a sellout. And in fact, it was true that many people changed their views because it was politically convenient to do so. And Dr. Montero brought to mind something which had never occurred to me, which is, that's one thing they had in common with Paul Robeson. At some point, Robeson had to know that a lot of things he said and a lot of the things he supported were wrong. And on the one hand, it's a big humiliation when you have to acknowledge that those who criticized you had right on their side. On the other hand, it's just too easy to suddenly confess to your sins and errors, especially when you're confessing it to people who don't have a jot, a scratch, an iota of integrity to begin with. So my parents wouldn't brook any criticism because they felt everybody else was just selling their souls for a price, and they refused to do that. Now, it had actually practical consequences, because in the 1980s already a Holocaust industry was starting up, and there were so-called survivors, because many of them were not, just pretended to be. Survivors were in high demand. Now, in the case of my mother and father, they were the real, as my mother liked to say, we're the real McCoy. We were in the camps. Every member of our family. I never had an aunt, I never had a cousin. My mother used to say, we are 5 people in the world. And they were in high demand to speak, to give testimony to their experiences. However, there was one quid pro quo. At that time, the campaign began to what was called the Free Soviet Jewry, the Jews in the Soviet Union. And one of the quid pro quo was you have to denounce Russia. You have to denounce the Soviet Union. And my mother and father would never do it. They would never go before an audience and say anything against the Soviet Union. Now, they liked money. And there was money to be had from this growth industry. But not at the price of those who really gave you life, because had the Soviet Union not defeated the Nazis, I wouldn't be here and they wouldn't be here. And so they wouldn't do it. And the bottom line is they couldn't be bought. As you now bring to my mind, the thing I admired most about Paul Robeson is you can't be bought. There are many lines of his which I remember keep with me to my dying day. And one of them was when he went before McCarthy, he said, I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch. And that stuck with me. Now, it happens, a lot of the things McCarthy was saying about the Soviet Union were true. However, he's not going to confess to them. They're swine. And that was something I took with me. Even to this day, I have sitting above my desk the picture of Robeson. I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch, even though I'm sure he had deep regrets about errors he had committed, as did Dr. Du Bois. So that's my reactions. As to the episode with Professor Dershowitz on Democracy Now!, he was very incensed at what happened on that program, and he began going around saying that it was a ambush. He said Amy Goodman and I ambushed him. And I replied that, well, actually, he did have a point. It really wasn't fair that the 2 parties in the debate, only one of us had read his book. It was a quite an amusing sight watching him on the camera. If you ever see the video, and when I'm making references to the book, he's turning to the pages and busily, like Evelyn Wood, for those of you who remember that. Evelyn Wood speed reading, trying to see what he wrote. Okay, one last order of business. Old friend of mine managed to make it here today, and she always deserves recognition, not just because she's a friend of mine, but as she's pushing the boundaries of eternity, Judith Chomsky has devoted the whole of her adult life, and non-adult life, to the cause of justice and political prisoners and all sorts of things like that. So if you just acknowledge yourself one more time. For those of you who are wondering whether her surname has any deep, profound connections, no, it's only coincidence. No, it's not. The topic I'm going to speak about this evening, it's not actually in the book, the Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, but it's based on the book, namely the developments since the book was published by serendipity, I guess. Soon after the book was published, in January last year, so it's a year ago now, a mass nonviolent civil resistance unfolded in Gaza. It came under the title of the Great March of Return, and eventually that title was slightly amended to the Great March of Return and to end the blockade. And even as we speak now, we're nearing almost a year anniversary, the demonstrations still continue. There are several thousand people every week still demonstrating, and several thousand people still fighting, and each week there are more casualties pile up and more people intentionally inflicted with what are called life-changing injuries. That is, the Israeli snipers along the fence are targeting the kneecaps of the demonstrators because they recognize too many deaths looks bad in the international media, whereas quote-unquote injuries get far less coverage, if any coverage really. However, for the person who has incurred a life-changing injury, and for the family and friends, it's an injury which is as much a deterrent as getting killed. And so Israel continues attempts to suppress and to put an end. Give me one half moment. Can you pass me that back? No. So Israel continues to target the demonstrators, hoping finally to put an end to them. But the people of Gaza, by a mixture of sheer fortitude and indomitable will, however alloyed with sheer desperation and hopelessness for the future, with no opportunity to escape Gaza, they continue. Yesterday I had a meeting with young people from parts of Europe, and we're going to try again to organize something to end the blockade of Gaza, a topic to which I will return. And that just reminds me, even though the person who spoke first tonight is absolutely marvelous, we had a good conversation on the way here, and I could see he had excellent political intuitions because we agreed on virtually everything. I remember my advisor in graduate school saying imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But he was a little bit pessimistic about young people. I have to say there are many deficits in the new generation. There's an awful lot of intelligence, and it's very exhilarating to see what's happening among young people now. I'm very hopeful about those new faces injected into our Congress. And I do believe Israel will have a very hard time in its next war because of those young people who have media attention, and they won't brook the sort of moral compromises and betrayals of their elders. So, with all due acknowledgement to what you said, I still think there's excellent grounds for hope now. As I witnessed yesterday talking to the young people in Europe, and also having participated in the Bernie Sanders campaign, going out of town in buses with mostly young people. I had never in my life, now I admit I was not part of the civil rights movement, but I was part of the anti-war movement. I had never in my life witnessed such moral seriousness, intelligence, as I did among the young people in Bernie Sanders campaign. It was extremely impressive, and I think it bodes well for the future. In any event, the topic I want to talk about tonight is one that comes up a lot, and which I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and that's the question of, do the guards of the Gaza ghetto, do the snipers along the periphery of Gaza, do they have a right to self-defense? Now, I want to preface my remarks by saying the following. It's a fashion among people of the left to denounce the law as being a tool of the powers that be, bourgeois law, imperialist law, rich man's law. And of course, there's a whole lot of truth to that. It's silly to deny that there's quite a lot in the law, which is quite awful. But one shouldn't be blind to the fact that there are many aspects of the law which are actually quite good. The problem is they're not enforced. Were the law actually enforced, we wouldn't be in heaven, far from it. We wouldn't have reached utopia, far from it. We wouldn't have created a society of justice and fairness, far from it. However, it would be a lot better than what we see around us today. If you just take the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, if the law were enforced, there would be no settlements. If the law were enforced, the Palestinians would have the right of return. That's the law. If the law were enforced, Israel would have to withdraw all of its troops from the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. A large chunk of the Israel-Palestine conflict, I don't think in total, but a large chunk of it would be resolved positively were the law enforced. So a little counsel from an elder to the young people in the room, one should be a little bit cautious about denouncing all of the law as being a, as it were, tool of the rich, the bourgeoisie, or white people, or whatever. I think the law is a much more complicated thing than that. And there are aspects of it which we should try to see that it's enforced and not to be too dismissive of it. And so tonight I want to look at what the law says about the right of the snipers along the periphery of Gaza, and also the right of Israel in general to use force, again, violent force, against the people of Gaza. It is true that the international community has strongly condemned Israel's armed response to the overwhelmingly nonviolent demonstrations in Gaza. The UN Security Council resolution, to quote the resolution, deplored the use of any excessive, disproportionate, and indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. And it came across many such condemnations. Probably the most noteworthy, at least in the first months of the demonstrations, were after May 14th, when Israel executed a large-scale bloodbath in Gaza. Human Rights Watch, who occasionally is good and occasionally is bad on the Israel-Palestine conflict, this time Human Rights Watch was very good. Facts are facts, and we should acknowledge them however they fall. Human Rights Watch wrote that Israeli forces' repeated use of lethal force in the Gaza Strip against demonstrators who pose no imminent threat to life, it may amount to war crimes. Obviously, these condemnations are welcome, but the question arises whether they go far enough. Simply put, does Israel have the right to use any force? Does Israel have the right to use any force under any circumstances against the people of Gaza? And that's the question I want to pose. Allow me to repeat it so you'll have it fixed in your mind as I proceed with the argument. Does Israel have the right to use any force under any circumstances against the people of Gaza? Most of you, I think, at this moment would be thinking, well, it probably has some right under certain circumstances to use some force. And I will try to demonstrate that, on the contrary, it has no right to use any force under any circumstances. Now, I want to emphasize as we proceed, I'm not giving you my opinion. I want to look at what the law says and at what one's ordinary moral intuitions tells him or her. This is not about an individual opinion. So let's proceed. The current legal debate on Gaza has focused on the following question. Did Israeli snipers resort to excessive or disproportionate force against demonstrators, as the critics of Israel allege, including, as you will recall, the Security Council resolution I quoted? They said Israel used excessive and disproportionate force. Or, as Israel claims, was the amount of force used necessary to prevent protesters from breaching the fence and entering Israel? Now, keep in mind, these are the two poles of the debate: excessive, disproportionate force versus necessary force. Those are the two established poles or parameters of the debate. All parties, however, seem to proceed from a common premise, that Israel does have a right to use force in order to prevent Gazans from breaching the fence. Israel does have a right. The dispute comes down to how much. Those who allege that Israel has used disproportionate or excessive force they're in effect saying that Israel has the right to use proportionate or moderate force. They don't have the right to use excessive and disproportionate force, but they have the right to use proportionate or moderate force. In the case of Human Rights Watch, they used the standard that the demonstrators posed no imminent threat to life. But implicitly, that's saying if the demonstrators had imminent threat to life, then Israel was within its right to use force. But the fact is, Israel cannot claim a right to use any force in Gaza, whether it be moderate or excessive, whether it be proportionate or disproportionate, whether the protesters are armed or unarmed, and whether or not the protesters do or don't pose an imminent threat to life. If it appears otherwise, and if in your own imaginations it appears otherwise, that's because in the first place, I think, people don't know what the law says. So let's go through that law. Number one, a simple proposition: the Palestinians are a people under international law. They have the right to self-determination, and they have a right to end the occupation in pursuit of their right to self-determination. Under international law, it's not a controversial proposition. It's not a even debatable proposition. Under international law, an occupying power does not have the right to use force to suppress a struggle for self-determination. That's the law. An occupying power, in this case Israel, does not have the right to use force to suppress a struggle for self-determination, which is the nature of the struggle of the people of Palestine. On the other hand, under international law, a people struggling for self-determination are not prohibited from using violent force to achieve their objective. So the law says, to put it in this instance, Israel has no right to use any force to deny the people of Palestine their right to self-determination and to end the occupation. On the other hand, nothing in the law says that the people of Palestine do not have the right to use force to end the occupation. As it happens in this particular instance, the Palestinians in Gaza have chosen overwhelmingly to use nonviolence in pursuit of their goal of self-determination. Obviously, that's not prohibited by the law, but it should be borne in mind that even if Gazans opted to use weapons against Israeli occupiers, Israel's resort to military force against them, it would still be illegal. Now, they've chosen to use nonviolence, but if they chose to use violent means to end the occupation, that's their right under international law, or at any rate, nothing in the law prohibits them. That is the consensus opinion. The world's leading scholar on the topic is James Crawford at Oxford, who produced a mammoth volume entitled The Creation of States Under International Law. It's incredibly tedious, boring, but also informative. I've read it several times, which I guess says something about my mental state. Now, in what so-called Western discourse, and I hate the word discourse, so you'll forgive me. There are certain words that are banned from company I keep. Discourse is one of them. Narrative is a second. Trope is a third. So if you use any of those three words in my presence, in the words of a famous Nazi, whenever I hear those words, I reach for a gun. He was referring to culture. That was his thing. In any event, in Western discourse, the allocation of rights and obligations has been completely reversed. So we're told that Israel has the right to use violent force and self-defense against Gazans, but we're told that the people of Gaza are obliged to wage non-violently their self-determination struggle. That's the exact reverse of what the law says. Now, it might be said, for those of you who are specialists in international law, and God help you if you are, that, well, Israel is an occupying power, and as an occupying power, it does have the right to what's called maintain public order, a famous phrase that's cited from the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the Fourth Geneva Convention. Do they have the right to maintain public order? And they have the right to maintain public order, it would follow as B follows Semaine, that they have the right to use force to maintain public order. But do they have that right? Actually, they don't have that right for a very simple reason. The essence of the Fourth Geneva Convention is, as its subtitle says, the protection of civilian persons in time of war. That's the purpose of the convention, to protect civilian persons in time of war. But what has Israel done? It's not protected the civil population in Gaza, or for that matter, the West Bank. Or in the case of Gaza, it's imposed a protracted siege, which international law has determined to be collective punishment. And in the case of Gaza, it's made a place, in the words of the United Nations, and quite conservative agencies, I might add, the quite conservative humanitarian agencies have described Gaza as already unlivable. It's not poetry. That's not hyperbole. That's a physical fact to which I return. I will return. Gaza is unlivable. Now, if you created a situation which is unlivable, you obviously cannot claim a right to maintain order when the population is resisting an unlivable situation, which is to say, having created an unlivable situation, you have annulled your right to maintain public order, unless you want to make the claim that people have no right to protest against those who have created an unlivable situation. And that would be a pretty difficult proposition to defend, especially as I mentioned a moment ago, the whole purpose of the Geneva Convention was the protection of civilians in time of war. So, let me now turn from the legal proposition to the intuitions that I referred to earlier. Moral philosophy comes down not to some proposition that can be defended rationally or systematically or methodically. It comes down to your intuitions. What do your intuitions tell you? So let's do a little, let's just go through this together. I want to bear in mind If you think that my intuitions are way off the beam, okay, then let's save it, and we'll discuss it later. But for the moment, I'm going to examine what seems to me ordinary, uncontroversial propositions. There's a basic principle of law. The law says you have no rights can be derived from illegal acts. No rights can be derived from illegal acts. International lawyers like to cite the Latin. My Latin isn't good. I'm American. I'm still struggling with English. But the Latin reads ex injuria non oritur jus. Anyone here know that expression? It's got to be, you know it? Yes, okay. Judith Chomsky knows it, so she is just one final Jeopardy. So, no rights can be derived from illegal acts. Now, most of you are probably, your eyes are rolling, or in your minds, your minds are rolling. What does that mean? Well, in simple terms, it means, for our purposes, that a right to self-defense does not obtain in all situations. You don't have a right to self-defense in all situations. The Israelis acting either as the snipers along the fence or Israeli society as a whole, they claim a right to self-defense against these demonstrators. But is there a uniform right to self-defense? Ask yourself a couple simple analogies. A rapist cannot claim a right to self-defense if the victim pummels him. A theater owner has no right to self-defense if patrons attack him after he sets the building ablaze and impedes their flight. You may laugh at that, but in a moment you will see the analogy is perfectly apropos. So let me repeat it. A theater owner has no right to self-defense if patrons attack him after he sets the building ablaze and impedes their flight. Israel's conduct vis-a-vis Gaza falls in this category of acts that render null and void the right to self-defense. Israel's conduct in Gaza renders the right to self-defense, just as in the case of the rapist and the theater owner, it renders the right to self-defense null and void. If it were otherwise, it would amount to Israel having the right to use military force in order to maintain an illegal occupation, compounded by an illegal siege. That doesn't, on the face of it, your moral intuitions tells you that couldn't be right, that Israel has a right to use violent force in order to maintain an illegal occupation compounded by an illegal siege. Now, if it's widely believed that Israel has that right, it's because these discussions on the technicalities of law have obscured the human stakes at play in Gaza. For those of you who read the New York Times, again, my condolences, they had an article which got a lot of coverage about the shooting of the medic Razan al-Najjar, and what was most striking about the article was the humanitarian crisis in Gaza was airbrushed out. There was no humanitarian crisis, catastrophe in Gaza. It was just demonstrators versus Israel trying to protect It's what they called southern communities from a breach of the fence. But the context, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza vanishes. It was as if somebody it's as if it's the play Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. That doesn't make sense. Or for those of you who have seen the film Casablanca, it's the film Casablanca without the German occupation. Nothing makes sense if you abstract from that fact. Why does Laszlo say in the climactic scene, play the Marseillaise? Play the Marseillaise. Unless you understand, there's an occupation going on. And it's that critical fact, what's been done to the people of Gaza, that's typically absent when you have these learned discussions about whether or not Israel has the right to use force. So first of all, let's start with the basics. What is Gaza? It's a narrow coastal strip, an enclave. It's among the most densely populated areas on the planet. More than 70% of its 2 million residents, more than 70% are refugees. While more than half of Gaza's 2 million people, 1 million are children. They're under the age of 18. 40% are under the age of 14. So when you hear Gaza, those should be the two salient facts that leap to the forefront of your mind. 70% are refugees. More than half are children. For over a decade, now it's coming on 13 years. The current phase of the blockade was imposed in January 2016 when the people of Gaza committed the cardinal sin of doing what they were told to do. The international community told them to vote in an election. They proceeded to vote, but it seems they missed the footnote. The footnote says you're supposed to elect who we want you to elect. They did not. They elected Hamas to power, mostly because at that point Hamas had a reputation for being a relatively clean governing party. And then, as soon as their election results were in, Israel imposed the blockade of Gaza, and then was quickly followed by the US and the EU. So, since January 2016, going on 13 years now, Israel has placed Gaza under a devastating siege. As of now, 13 years later, more than 50% of Gaza's workforce is unemployed. More than 50% of the people of Gaza live below the poverty line. 80% depend on international food aid. And 97% of the tap water in Gaza is contaminated. It is unpotable, it is undrinkable. In the year 2018, the Gaza economy registered a negative 6% growth. As all experts agree, the root cause of this humanitarian catastrophe is the Israeli blockade. The fence separating Gaza from Israel is no more a border. We're always told that Israel is trying to protect its borders. That's not a border. What's separating Gaza from Israel is not a border, any more than Gaza is a state. Distinguished Hebrew University professor Baruch Kimmerling, he called Gaza a concentration camp. Actually, he said it's the largest concentration camp ever. The former conservative UK Prime Minister David Cameron, he called Gaza an open-air prison. The distinguished Israeli newspaper Haaretz called Gaza a ghetto. The Economist, he called Gaza a human rubbish heap. The International Committee of the Red Cross, they called Gaza a sinking ship. The International Monetary Fund, they called Gaza a human catastrophe. Gaza is what the UN Human Rights Chief called a toxic slum, in which he said an entire civilian population is caged from birth to death. A toxic slum in which an entire civilian population is caged from birth to death. Bear in mind that civilian population, 1 million are children. The UN humanitarian coordinator for Gaza, Robert Pieper, he said, I see this extraordinarily inhuman and unjust process of strangling gradually 2 million civilians that really pose a threat to nobody. Now you ask yourself the question, what do your moral intuitions tell you? Does Israel have the right to use force to encage Gaza's 1 million children in a ghetto or a toxic slum? Do they have that right? Don't the people of Gaza have the right to break free from a concentration camp? Does anyone now debate whether Germany used excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? Can anyone even conceive of a question like that? Did Germany use excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? Who now ponders whether Germany had a right to self-defense against the Jewish fighting organization in Gaza, which incidentally didn't resist non-violently, but as Jews proudly like to say, with arms in hand? Now, some of you who recoil at the Nazi analogy, and in large parts of the world now it's illegal to make such an analogy. Some of you will say, but Gaza is not the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, an Israeli journalist who served in Gaza during the first Intifada, when Gaza was like heaven as compared to now, he wrote a famous article in the New York Review of Books. His name was Ari Shabbat, who had his day in the sun, and then he got caught up in the Me Too movement, and he disappeared. He said at the time, referring to the analogy between Gaza and the Warsaw Ghetto, and he was explicit. He said, The problem is not in the similarity, but that there isn't enough lack of similarity. Experts predict that Gaza will soon be overrun by typhoid and cholera, like the epidemics that decimated Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. According to the Rand Corporation, again a very conservative think tank, already more than a quarter of all reported disease in Gaza is caused by poor water quality and access, and is the leading cause of childhood morbidity. They said the risk of an outbreak of a waterborne or other intestinal disease in Gaza is high. The World Health Organization said that over 1 million people in Gaza are at risk of contracting waterborne diseases. There's a very decent human being who I came to be friends with over the past decade or so, Sarah Roy. She teaches over at Harvard. No, she doesn't teach. She has a research think tank at Harvard. Sarah Roy, specializing, she's the world's leading authority in Gaza's economy. She's also the daughter of Holocaust survivors, the real thing, the real McCoy. Both of them were in Auschwitz. And she's a practicing Jew, which I am not. But we get along very well. She's just a really decent person. And as I said, she wrote the standard study of Gaza's economy. And a new edition of it recently came out. And she wrote in the new edition, innocent human beings, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink and likely by the soil in which they plant. And so to my mind, and then it's, as I said, up to you whether you agree with my intuitions, to my mind, the only morally sane question presented by the situation in Gaza is, does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to poison 1 million children? Does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to poison 1 million children? And if your answer is no, then I think it's correct to say that there is no circumstances under which Israel can justify its use of force against the people of Gaza. Thank you.